Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a getting started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit. Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path. What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? Today, we are being with our heartbreak, our grief, and our rage and our helplessness, our feeling of helplessness after the latest U.S. mass shooting in Parkland, Florida. And it's depressing and exhausting even to say the latest and to know that by the time this airs, maybe it won't be the latest. So for those of us in the U.S., it's a time of a lot of insanity and a lot of loss here. And with our work on Bliss and Grit, we do our best as fallible human beings who are subject to fallible human things. We do our best not to promote a spiritual path that is a bypass. So one that's not about up and away to the magical no suffering enlightenment place. To be human is to have a human experience, and that includes suffering. It also includes heaven on earth, and it includes everything in between. So in this conversation, we're really processing our own heartbreak and trying to inquire about how do we be with the really massive, raw emotions when they do come. And these days in our country, in a myriad of different ways, they are coming quite a lot. If you're enjoying the show, you can leave a review on iTunes or on Facebook. You can also head to blissandgrit.com to subscribe to get our weekly digest or become a supporting member at patreon.com/blissandgrit. And the last thing is that we do swear sometimes. So if you don't want that to be heard by your company, you can wear headphones. Okay, here we go. Hey, Vanessa.
Hello, darling.
I don't know where today's episode will go, even more so than normal. So we're both dealing with our feelings after the Parkland shooting, which was, closely on the heels of so many other mass shootings. And we also have the two episodes that preceded this one. One was about forgiveness, and the other one was about, belonging and true intimacy, and that we belong to ourselves first. And then here we are, So I think that it's worth having a ground level conversation about these really, intense emotions that I'm dealing with. And just so that people can get a sense, and so that you and I can explore that when we're having these conversations about being on a spiritual path and some of the things that come with that, like how do we really belong to ourselves? How do we really commune with ourselves? How do we really forgive? That these things are not tidy. They're never tidy. They're never tidy in practice, and they're not intended to be tidy in concept either, when we talk about them. So it's not like we have anything where we're going to explain, principles or anything. We're just kind of sitting with in real time. And for me personally, so all that said, I'll start. I'm in Connecticut. I'm not so far away from Newtown, and I was there the week after it happened as a part of a pop-up healing space. It's going to be an emotional call. And I I saw those families come in, and I had my hands as a part of the cause, touching the children who were in the school that day and who had survived. And then I watched spring up in the aftermath of that so many of my neighbors and people who live around me and people who drive on the highway with me with their new stickers on their cars that were images of semi-automatic rifles, or images saying "Carry on, Connecticut," meaning open carry, but also just move on. The pushback. And that would be a response in your state to a senseless murder of so many children and adults. And I still see those stickers everywhere. And, this is one of the causes that's closest to my heart. And I continue to participate in that in every way that I can. And so every time this happens, I'm just, it brings up obviously really raw grief and rage, so much rage, and loss of faith in my species. It's interesting. I was thinking about it because you and I talk so much about the individual shame that we each carry about ourselves. And what it brings up for me is actually like shame about my entire species. Like, I'm so ashamed of all of humanity, and I'm ashamed to be a part of it. So these things, there is no place where we go where we are untouched. Like, the spiritual path is not the over there, right? Like, there is heaven on earth. There is touching into heaven. There is all the things we've talked about. Maybe it's not a problem. All that stuff, right, exists at the exact same time as being deeply touched by the things that happen in our world and being a human being on a human journey, right? Where we experience all of the things that, I don't know how to deal with this. Like, I feel so enraged and so helpless and so ashamed of all of humanity, certainly ashamed of my country. So here we are, sitting with it, and we're not going to tie it up with a neat little bow by the end. But I'm hoping that talking about it is just a way for, to demonstrate that at no point are we trying to illustrate a path of bypass where we go over there to that sunny place, that as long as we're in a human body, we're going to have a human experience, and it involves all of the things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rather than, excuse me, I just got over the flu, everyone. So excuse me if you hear that in my voice, you sensitive listeners. Makes me think, as opposed to going over to the sunny place, so often what we're talking about is what Buddha called the middle path. And he may not have used it to describe exactly what I'm about to mention, but this way that we can have our eyes open and our hearts open to what's happening in our world, what's happening within us, what's happening around us, and yet not get subsumed and identified and sort of lost in it, like literally lost in it. Like, we can't find an anchor or a foothold. We can't remember anything but the time when this existed, whatever this is for us. And I think that's actually a very difficult place for us. And I'm not talking about equanimity. If any of you have studied Eastern philosophy or Buddhism, you may have heard the term equanimity. And equanimity has this sense of balance, this sense of internal peace. I'm not even talking about that, because right now the Dalai Lama does not have equanimity about the kind of pain and injustices that are happening in the world, nor does teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh or Roshi Joan Halifax or any of the revolutionaries who stand before us who are on the spiritual path. It's not, Who cares? It's all a great balancing act and it's all working out somehow in the end. What we're talking about is how can you stand sort of the way Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche would look at a warrior, with your feet on the ground, meaning awareness of what's happening, your eyes open, clarity, your heart open, love, emotion, connection, even though there's so much pain and suffering in the world. It's this really interesting place. I feel like so often we're either desperately trying to find that sunny place, which has probably been a lot of how I've coped in my lifetime, or we are just drowning in it. We can't watch enough news. We're crying over the suffering of the world all of the time, right? Like we can't sort of get our feet on the ground and our breath in our lungs so that we can hold it from 1,000 perspectives. And I guess that's a bit of the dance that I've been engaging in. It's funny, this week, so I had the flu and this all happened. So I'm home. I can't read. I can't really think. I can't concentrate too long. I can mostly just lay there. And so I'm laying there with this, right? Just with this, with how the fuck does this happen is really what I'm laying there with. Like, how in the world can this happen? And how can people like you were just describing, Brooke, it's so unrelatable and incomprehensible. The level of disconnection and the lack of empathy required to attack after a tragedy like this happens, like put those bumper stickers on your car in this flagrant disregard for the parents who lost children there. Or have you noticed on both sides, people who are Trump supporters and people who are not Trump supporters attacking each other in the aftermath of this crime? I mean, I saw people attack a man who had a Trump shirt on, who had a picture of his daughter who was lost, and just go to town on him. And then, of course, it's been very obvious, the NRA supporters who are attacking innocent victims. The whole thing is so incomprehensible. And that's what I've really spent the week with. It's unusual that I'm not someone who wires towards anger very readily. Seems sociopathic men, when they attack my friends, are the only people who get me really to the enraged point. I am more grief and like honest, deep down confusion, like befuddlement. And so I've been trying to just, read article after article on what are the root causes of this level of human disconnect that would allow someone to kill children, kill in general, but to massacre children, and then B, a country to just flagrantly disregard that they're contributing to this. And there is this interesting dance, right, of being able to keep your eyes open to it and get informed about it, like really get to know an issue from the inside out and kind of try it on for size and feel the edges and everything like that, and not go down an obsessive kind of drowning rabbit hole with it.
Yeah. And also, it's everything we're talking about is about the delicate balance, but it's a very delicate balance because I do find that when I'm feeling this way, for example, when I'm feeling this way, one of the things I have to really let it have me as much as it wants to have its way with me, which is a delicate thing, right? Because it would be very easy to identify with that and get stuck in the weeds, like you were talking about, and then wind up in a place that's just not useful to myself or humanity, right? Just to become totally lost and totally broken. Like, I guess there's a difference between broken and broken open, right? And broken open is a real thing. And it happens when something's so big that you do have to let it have you for however long that fire needs to burn. Or, for example, like you were talking about, reading all these articles and really trying to understand what is the root cause. And for me in my life, since I was a young child, I don't know why, but like seeing and then over many, many, many years, really deeply understanding the pattern called sociopathy has just been a theme of my life. I don't know why, but it's come through this life that like I've seen and interacted with it in many ways, many times, in many guises, and at a certain point was also called to read all the books and really, really like get basically PhD level understanding of sociopathy. I don't know why that is a part of this one named Brooke, but it is. And so there are certain things, certain dark and heavy and awful and unbearable things that do just keep knocking. And at a certain point, they are just whatever invitation they are, and I don't need to tell a story about the invitation, like, oh, it's so that I can, I guess a simplistic one might be like, write a book about sociopathy. Like, I don't feel at all called to write a book about sociopathy, but like, I can't apply it in some obvious way where I would go, oh, that's why, and like put a period at the end of that sentence. But it shows up enough that I have to engage with it. Or I guess one of the things that I'm getting at a little bit is that these very, very large emotions and experiences that can feel annihilating. This word is such a terrible word to use because it's so easily bright-sided. But I was going to say, on a certain level, they are an invitation, not in a tidy way, like, oh, good, I'm being invited to be the one who understands that, or the one who feels this all-consuming rage and despair. Oh, good, Or it'll be so useful eventually. Isn't it great news? It's not so easy as that. It's actually, in many ways, like much more simple, where it's like, it's just like a noticing. And I've heard Matt Kahn talk too about, not in this context, but about, it's like watching a movie and then going, why did the movie get written that way? And it's like, I don't know. It just didn't. It's like, no. I want the movie to be written differently, which we're all allowed to feel. God bless, and I think that's a call in and of itself, is to hear what we want to have different. And that's the birth of our own activism in the world. But there is this very simple place we begin where it's just, I don't know why, but it seems like this movie is written this way. And for whatever reason, that gives me enough of a gap where I can land in myself and I don't go into some of the bigger, more spinning out places. So maybe I'm feeling consumed by rage, helplessness, and despair. But I don't know why, but I do know the movie is written this way right now. Like, this is for sure, for real happening. It does reconnect me to like my breath, where I can just be the one who those huge, huge emotions are moving through and breathe with them. And they have, when the time is right, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, like once they've become familiar enough companions that are in me and with me, whether it's large emotions or things that I'm called to learn and engage with, at a certain point, they do become something out there in the world that I'm living, right? Like they do become a part of some kind of movement towards the world, whether it's something really, really simple, like how I interact with people at the grocery store, or some larger call to action. But I can't have those moments. My life can't be lived in that way if I'm really just spinning forever.
Well, you're not saying it just like this, but the more identified we become with an emotional state, the less room we have, right? The more like we're kind of like enmeshed with it. So if you think I am rage and there's no way I can feel but rage, and rage is the response and the only response and the appropriate response and the safe response, you know, whatever level your subconscious is approaching that, then there's no way to get the clarity that's within the rage, right? The yin within the yang. I mean, I'm thinking when you were talking about the way the Buddhists think about wrathful deities. And so in Tibetan Buddhism, they have all of these different deities, gods, goddesses, you can call it like that. You can call it archetypes, relate to it however you want to, but they're representations of energies within the human experience. And they have all of these wrathful deities that will feel things like rage, like despair, you know, like fear. And they'll bring it up in you and they'll bring it forward in you. And there's a reason for it. And if we think about anger, in Buddhism, they say like within anger, there's the seed of discernment. So you need that. You know, anger can bring us to clarity. This is wrong. This is unjust. There's no love in this. This cannot be just. The dilemma is we can get so fused with that emotion of anger that we actually just don't see straight anymore. And I think that's where when people say, be careful, that delicate balance you and I were talking about, you can get subsumed by something. All we're really talking about is we can become so enmeshed in the narratives that the emotions themselves can start to spin in us that we can't see clarity. Like, what is the way through? What's the way to show up? So I guess I'm thinking about, so I was listening to a podcast with Roshi Joan Halifax and a guy named Raghu Marcus, who was a friend of Ram Dass's and does a podcast on his network. And sometimes I just have to look to my elders, quite frankly. Like when I'm struggling with how to deal with social issues, I look to Joanna Macy, I look to Roshi Joan Halifax, I look to the Dalai Lama. Like I look and I'm like, how are you dealing with this? What can you offer me, you know? And I'm listening to her and they were talking about a world sometime in the last year she was on. I don't remember the date. Anyway, she was talking about when she was living in the prison system and meeting, not living in, but immersing herself into the prison system. And she was talking about how it took her a full year to become aware of all of the different subtle levels of blockages she had, reactions she had, triggers she had around finding any level of compassion and empathy for murderers. And she had a year-long exploration of it. She didn't talk about it with people. She didn't make public statements on it, which she does very often make public statements. She needed that time to discern more clearly what they call in Buddhism skillful means. In other words, what is actually going to create a movement of health, right? A movement towards health. And that's what they call skillful means, that it takes a certain level of clarity and discernment and heart and contemplation and wisdom to be able to understand how to create like a revolution. And I mean literally like a movement of something around, forward. And so that to me is a very interesting statement. It doesn't mean everyone can't engage right now. Of course you can, but it is pointing us towards that when these big emotions come pouring through, grief, rage, despair, that usually there are these subtle little hooks within it that are for us, right? For us to kind of get a little more movement on, get a little more freedom with, so then we can gain access to that level of discernment and clarity that can propel us forward. Because I'm thinking right now, everybody is so hurt. I get it. I am too. And if you look at what people are doing to each other on social media, that will never create a good effect.
No.
Attacking someone or shaming someone tends not to have a really benevolent movement. It tends to get both sides entrenched. And the problem here is a lack of listening, like deep, deep listening and hearing. So that's what I think we're talking about is, can you get enough breath? Can you get enough space so that you can begin to relate with the intensity of all of these emotions that come through, not making any of them bad, not honoring any above all the others, but just being with and watching from that observation, open eyes, open heart, feet on the ground, kind of a stance. So then you can get a really good idea of what skillful means would look like for you.
Yeah. And when I say like, let it have you, that's a part of what I'm trying to get at, is that that we have a right to our own metabolizing process on the inside. And that if we move too quickly, we just metastasize the cancers everywhere. Like, it's been interesting to notice in myself. I mean, really what I'm dealing with, totally honestly, much of the time is a murderous rage. I want to kill people over this, like that kind of feeling. And I know exactly what labels I give the people I want to kill. It's really interesting to watch. I have enough space to see that's really interesting, because my grief and despair and outrage over murderous rage, my response is murderous rage. Like, we really do get hooked by those things. And I could act from that place very easily. I could act from that place just in my local community with the way I interact with people who I know. It will not help, so we have a right to go inside, like Roshi Joan Halifax was talking about. Like, she needed a year to really be with. And we aren't all great at being with ourselves internally. It's certainly not something that we see so much, modeled in the culture, which is part of how we get into all these problems in the first place. The day after the shooting happened, the only thing I could think of to do was to listen to Matt Kahn and lay in bed. So I did that for a day. And fortunately, the talk of his that I put on, I'm paraphrasing, but he was talking about kind of like, I'm going to badly paraphrase, so I'll just say what I got from it. What I got from it was like, what if you just make yourself, instead of making yourself a solid person with storylines and attached and all that stuff, like, what if you just make yourself the verb that you currently are? So in that moment, it was like, I am despairing. I am furious. I'm raging, and that was what was true in that exact moment when I first heard his words. And then what I noticed is that if I could stay with letting myself be a verb, you don't actually stay one verb for a super long time. You're not despairing for 24 hours. You're despairing, and then you're standing up, and then you're washing dishes, and then you're grieving, and then you're cooking lunch, and then you're seeing clients, and then you're raging. And then you're wondering, like, then it does feel like weather. And so it's much harder to attach to a state and to identify with it in a way where it has its way with you in the bad way, right? Where you become it and you don't ever get to participate in the world. And you also don't ever get to metabolize whatever the invitation is. Ultimately, how will you act? Like you were saying, like, how will you actual revolution, right? Like, how is there a different kind of movement going forward? And so if we are just whatever verb we are in any given moment, what we notice, first of all, is that life is lifing itself, right? That it does move like the weather. We move like the weather. And that we do act, when I have murderous rage over this, I am identified. Because murderous rage, the fuel for it is the storylines, right? About like whose fault. So blame is a huge one. Whose fault? Who am I going to get? I'll do anything to make it stop. The world is not safe. I feel disgusted by my entire species, blah, blah, and it goes on and on and on. And I'm not saying that any one of us listening or living or existing needs to say, hey, wait a second. There are people at fault. I'm not trying to take that away in the sense that like those things are, forbidden, right? Like, which would be a spiritual bypass. If only bad people would ever decide that somebody's at fault. That's not what I'm trying to say. But what I am saying is that when we hold it in place and we identify it and we're out there and we're objectifying everyone and dividing them up into these neat, tidy little categories, there cannot be a healing movement. And I think what we all really want is a different kind of world. And we cannot keep doing the same shit and expect for that to happen. And it starts with us. And that's hard work. It's a very courageous and very challenging invitation to be able to do that internally.
Yeah, and it's confusing. I mean, I know this is a really stupid example, but this is what was happening for me yesterday. As I was laying on the couch, incapacitated, I was watching the movie Gladiator. And it was like the first scene of Gladiator, and there was a war going on, and the Romans and the Germans are just barbarically, killing each other. And I started to just think about how this is what the world used to look like, like all the time, like 24/7. Someone was murdering you and taking what was yours. And I don't know, it's just this really weird sense talking about human nature and like exploring human nature. And then I'm thinking, in many ways, there is a difference. It's almost like there's enough spaciousness because humanity has evolved to some extent. There's enough spaciousness to start to notice where it hasn't. Like I think there was a time, and maybe in some parts of the globe it still feels like that. I can only speak to my experience, but there was a time when these levels of violence and objectification and division, good versus evil, us versus them, were so much a part of the human experience. There's no space to even question it for most people, I would imagine. And so now, when that's not our everyday reality, thank God, in the West, in the United States where I am, thank God, it's not my everyday reality at the very least. You open your eyes and you look around and you're going, how can any of this remain? Right? Like, how can my species be like this? Whereas meanwhile, if you look at it over the course of time, it's like our species is, pretty much animals.
Yeah, we're animals, people.
Pretty much animals. And we're defending our
animals.
territory kind of like 24/7, grossly, violently defending our territory, which is crazy. And you get this sensation like, if only I shake you hard enough, you'll see. I don't know when that's ever worked.
It does not seem to have worked.
The sensation's there. Like,
it is there.
I feel like if I could just beat you.
Yeah. I feel that way.
Like that whole idea that you could knock some sense into somebody, and knock some light into somebody. And then when we slow that down, because we can realize, like, we know that doesn't work, right? So once we have the privilege of understanding, okay, that doesn't work, we have to start to get more creative. Like, okay, so there's somebody doing something that is unjust and intolerable. I'm not even talking about the murderers at this point. That's just like plain old, I don't know, psychotic. I'm not sure. I'm not talking about the murderers. I'm talking about the people who have the laws in place when I'm looking at it right now. So you're thinking there's someone doing something unjust and intolerable. I can't beat it out of them. I can't shake it out of them. Apparently, I can't shame it out of them, right? Trying. And if that young girl in Fort Lauderdale saying shame on you doesn't turn anybody, then we know, me writing some vicious Facebook comment is not shaming someone out of their view. And then you're like, now what? And that's a really real problem. You know, at some point, Nelson Mandela felt he had to engage in some terrorist action to wake people up to injustice. At another point, he decided he had to go through a process of creating equality and forgiveness. The Dalai Lama deals with this daily. Like, what will he do if he goes on a war rampage and tries to get military action against China? It just creates more violence. And then eventually, even if they win, China will come back. I mean, this is the level at which we have to start to explore our problems, because in 2018, we all stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. So we see what doesn't work, like big picture. And I don't see any easy path through, but I think it's why we have to start with trying to understand the variables at play. Like, what in the world could make someone turn their back on children? And this gross lack of empathy that in part seems to be a complete disconnect that I think somewhat happens because of technology. And somewhat happens because it almost seems to me, Brooke, that sometimes if you haven't really been in someone's shoes, you just can't get it.
Yeah.
And this is what we're dealing with in our country. Maybe, you know, we have a lot of international listeners. I'm curious to hear what you all are dealing with in your own countries. But is we see that the old way doesn't work. We have a lot of emotions. Some of them are primal, and they say, shake them, beat them, shame them. And yet we know that doesn't work. What do we do? I don't have any answers.
No, me either, except that we can only acknowledge what's true, which is that we feel this way, you know, and whatever, like if we're verbing it, right, that we can stay close to the movements of how we feel and really be honest with ourselves about how we're feeling. That's all I got.
I mean, okay, now I know this might be grand wishful thinking. Well, I'm sure it is, because it probably has worked such a small percentage of times on any big scale, you know, outside of small groups. But on some level, my mind says there has to be communication, right? Nothing can change until an actual communication takes place, which means different people hearing / feeling / sensing, like really hearing others' points of view.
Yeah.
It's like, I remember, did you read that story that they were sharing on Facebook about the Black man who went and like, I think he converted like 100 and something Klan men over time by going and eat with them, which I thought was phenomenal. And then other, you know, of course, he still got negative comments on Facebook where people were like, you're not doing it right. Like, what?
Are you fucking kidding? Yeah, I know. You know what kind of courage that takes?
Come on. That's crazy. It's amazing. That means to me, when I hear that those people never listened to a Black person before. They never heard them. They never felt them. They never sensed them. They never saw the world through anyone's eyes, but they're, I'm going to say something so rude, crusty old ones. You know?
Sometimes we have to be assholes when we feel big feelings. That's fine.
Talk about globalizing. I know there are young racists, but
yes, we've seen plenty.
Anyway, just the fact that something happened where someone heard, or, you know, I know that I'm sure that the South African reparation healings weren't miraculous. I'm sure that someone could analyze them and say there was fault in it somehow. I'm not aware of any of that, but there were stories in it that were miraculous. Or God, you know, recently when the veterans went to the Native Americans and offered apologies.
That was so beautiful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right. And once that happened, there's a softening, and then there's a dialogue. And then all of a sudden we're people trying to solve something together. And you never know what can unfold because every moment is fresh. Once we're people having an actual dialogue together, if we're caricatures of ourselves, meaning we're so identified with a particular narrative and way of being, and we're fighting for this conceptual self that is this caricature, no one ever hears each other. And it's like words and actions are just bouncing like ping pongs back and forth. And that's how I feel lately. Like if kids dying can't get through to you, then something's bouncing right off of you, because I refuse to imagine that every person who's in defense of gun laws is a bad human being.
No, I absolutely refuse to believe that too. I will not do that. Yes, where I put us in these tidy containers. No.
So then what's happening? Where is it going awry that we can't advance this conversation somewhere that simply protects our children? I mean, I'm not even talking about wiping guns off the continent or anything unusual. Like, that says something. I mean, that to me is, I think the biggest problem we have in our country, honestly, is a lack of empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I don't know if we mentioned this in our last episode, but the episode we were referencing with Brene Brown and Krista Tippett, Brene Brown was talking about, like, there is a very small percentage of people who have a lot of power and who benefit tremendously when we are holding each other in separate categories of the good ones and the bad ones and infighting. They benefit tremendously when we don't have empathy or capacity to have civil conversations. And so it is our work to dig fucking deep and figure out how to have civil conversations. And if that means that in a moment in time, I am not emotionally fit to have those conversations or to show empathy, I have to acknowledge that. And I have to let that emotion have me, meaning that's it. Just acknowledge this is what's up. Yeah. I am not going to be of use. Yep. I'm not going to be of use to humanity right now. And it won't last forever. And I understand that the problem is empathy and is a lack of civil conversations. And those things take tremendous, tremendous courage, to be able to walk the middle way, to be able to hold space that middle way exists, and to be able to hold space that humanity is basically good. And I'm somebody who believes in evil. I believe certain characters come here to bring darkness to the world. But why? And it's like, in my life, all of my empathy is courtesy of humility at the hands of suffering. Like you were saying, I mean, people who haven't really deeply experienced pain, or they categorize their pain like, well, I've had this kind of pain and this is the kind of pain my people have, but those people over there, their pain's different than mine and I don't have any empathy for that kind of pain or whatever. This is the trouble. This is where things break down. We have all been humbled, and we're going to continue to be humbled because we're humans. But if we can let it break us open into empathy for humanity, then things can begin to change. And when that's not the case, and I'm feeling shame about how disgusting my entire species is, I have to be really honest with myself that is what's going on. Not forever. Right.
And surely you're not alone in it. The line from, you may have heard of this book called the Bible, the line from the Bible that Jesus used. This is what's coming out of my mouth right now. I'm sorry. I still have flu brain, everyone. But there's a famous line from the Bible where Jesus says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." Mm-hmm. And that line always goes through my head. I don't know where it comes from in me, but I do have a very deep sense of mercy for humanity. And I remember when I started studying psychology, sometimes in school, people would say that they wanted to work with people who actually suffer, not people who suffer neurotically. So capital T traumas, or maybe right now they're growing up in an abusive household, or maybe they don't have enough money to make ends meet, and these kinds of like actual sufferings, or they have a disease that they're grappling with, and they're dealing with mortality issues, things like that. And I always remember feeling that neurotic suffering had its own type of hell dimension that needed to be addressed. And I know I'm fairly privileged in my life in that I have been through suffering, but not to the extent of some of those big capital T traumas. Thank God. And yet I always thought it was so crazy that you could suffer so much unnecessarily. That's what neuroses is, right? That there's not something happening in your midst, and yet there you are, and you're conjuring stories that make you suffer. And when I look around at the world that we live in, people are suffering mightily. I mean, mightily. Stand in a grocery store and breathe and feel into your body, and just for one moment, put yourself into the shoes of everybody walking by. And it's like everybody is suffering so mightily. And I think that's where I start to get this sense of mercy for humanity. And my God, people don't even know the prisons that they're creating for themselves. And unfortunately, what gets us so angry, what gets us so upset, is that people are allowing their own neurotic prisons to harm others. And that's where it starts to get really almost impossible to sit with, right? So intense and so painful that it's almost impossible to sit with. It's one thing when you're over there suffering in your own private hell. I wish I could save you, but you're not doing anything wrong to me. And it's another thing when in your own life, maybe you have an abusive parent, or maybe you have an alcoholic parent, or within your ecosystem, maybe there was a priest abusing kids, or, whatever thing is happening in your world, and you recognize this person won't do their own work to release themselves from the hell that they're tormented by. And then they're just going around inflicting pain on others because of it. And it's like, where's the fairness? That's where I guess we've talked about the concept of fairness before, but damn if it doesn't come up right there. Like, how is this fair? And you're like going about living your life, and all of this is happening. And I don't know, I think it's a difficult thing not to excuse human behavior, but also to find some way to relate to why others are creating suffering, which I think I don't have an answer to. I just feel, especially since many of you listening are practitioners of sorts, you're out there working with people, you're helping people, you're dealing with gobs of suffering. If you're not, you're probably an empath or a sensei, and you are dealing with gobs of suffering. And I think most of us are going through this to some level. And I don't think the world is becoming a worse place. I actually don't. But I do think that everything's coming to the foreground in complex ways, especially as our ecosystem gets stressed. This will keep happening. And somehow we are all called, the invitation is, how are we going to deal with the fact that humans create suffering? How are we going to deal with that? What's our relationship to that? Right now, maybe, Brooke, your current relationship is, well, humans suck and we should be annihilated. We're a grand mistake. Right now,
You say that in such a chipper way. That's the flavor of my particular dark place. It always has been.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to put words in Reggie Ray's mouth, but sometimes I feel when he's talking, that's kind of his solution. It's like, well, maybe the environment's just going to take the humans off it.
He and I both go to a similar place. We're like, yeah, well.
Oh, well, guess
nasty species anyway.
Yeah, we really screwed up a bunch of things. And I just seem to have to come back. I think it's my own form of coping mechanism not to say anyone should adopt it. I just seem in my coping mechanism to always come back to human nature and what's up and how can I relate to it and how can I understand the things we do, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Mm-hmm. Two things I just want to say for people listening three things in terms of resources. Books that have been very helpful to me lately and recently are Steven Pinker's books, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now. If you want, it's heady because he's a conceptual guy, but if you need to touch into some very hard data about the fact that our species actually is improving, that's helpful. Some of us have brains who need that as a lifeline sometimes. And the other thing I found myself doing in the midst of this, I'm ashamed of this whole species, we're the worst thing. I was at the Museum of Science in Boston this past weekend, so crowded place, lots of humans. And I was for a exhibit, sitting at one point in stadium, sitting with all these other people who were sitting. And I decided to spend that time silently saying ho'oponopono to everyone, as if, I don't know why it even occurred to me to do it. It just arose spontaneously, but as if I was saying to everyone at the same time, I am so sorry. Please forgive me. I love you. Thank you. I do not know why, but it was deeply soothing to me. And I think it's because whatever inspired me to do it was just some basic kernel of mercy. And it really felt like genuine relief flowing through my whole system. And we talked about this some on the forgiveness episode too, like doing this with strangers, but something about going through the repetitive chant of ho'oponopono in my head, me like sort of prostrating myself, right, to humanity, everyone there. I am so sorry. It just felt like I could touch our humanness, our collective humanness, and touch our collective woundedness in a way that made me feel tenderness and made me feel a part of, and not do my defense mechanism thing of like, wouldn't it be great, if the whole species disappeared, which is just a defense mechanism, right? And it's fine that happens, but finding the places where you can touch into mercy, because that is a healing movement.
I think that when, in times like these, when people feel called towards social activism, and especially when they're called towards social activism within a spiritual container, I really think that it's important that you're not alone in the journey. And so whether you actually have, friends or a sangha that you're working with, I will often recommend to people to find those elders that resonate with you. Whether for me, I go to Joanna Macy and I go to Roshi Joan Halifax and I go to Thich Nhat Hanh and sometimes the Dalai Lama. But I think, Roshi Joan Halifax was talking about empathy fatigue. And we know there's a lot of terminology for this: compassion fatigue, empathy. She uses the word empathy instead of compassion. She uses them a little differently. But there's this place where, again, we're talking about how do we find that middle path. And when we're really engaged in trying to create resistance in the world, a revolution, a movement, something shifting in the world, we get so much news coming at us. It comes really fast and furious these days. There's some research to show it's just almost neurobiologically more than we can handle. We feel so many feelings. And I think we actually have to build some skill sets around this. So you and I, Brooke, are beginning to touch on how do we sit with these things. But it's complex and there's quite a bit to it. And it's a little bit individual as well, depending on where you're at and what kind of things arise for you. So I don't think we should underestimate how much of a skill it is to stay with open eyes and an open heart looking at what happens with human suffering. I mean, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche would say that's a warrior's path. And he does not use any words lightly.
No.
And he was not for flattering people. He meant it. And I think that these days it can feel so natural to us. We can be so moved towards it that we may have a habit of underestimating what this takes psychologically, energetically, physically to sustain a movement. And there's a lot of talk about this. So I think that right now, if you find that you're called to action, and I mean really called to action, I don't just mean called to call your Congress people, a few times. I mean really called forward, especially, then understanding a bit about the kinds of skills you need so that you can have a kind and compassionate and sustainable approach with yourself, which is what you need in order to keep bringing forward your gifts and your energy to change the world.
Yeah. And just, piggybacking on that a little bit, like just remembering that, again, this very small percentage of people who hold an awful lot of power, it is also in their best interest that we are fatigued. We are bombarded by design so that we will burn out. And so creating containers where we can do our internal work, creating support systems, nourishment for ourselves so that we can sustain is an act of resistance. And we have to remember that. It is a revolutionary act. It's a part of that. So keep that in mind too. It's not you being lazy when you could be over there doing the important thing. It's a part of sustaining the journey. It's a big journey. And we're designed to be overwhelmed by people who are pulling strings. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. You can see each episode's separate post, and the resources are within each post. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit, where you can donate to the show, but you'll also get rewards for your support. So if you're wanting a place where you can engage with us and with these topics in a deeper way in community, that's a good place to go. Or if you don't feel like chatting up people, but you would love some downloadable meditations or a getting started guide or things like that, that is there too. We are on Instagram and Facebook, and we're pretty readily available and responsive there. And on blissandgrit.com, there is a weekly digest of resources that we are currently loving if you subscribe. We're really grateful for all the reviews that you've all written and all the sweet support and feedback. So here is one from Tracy Alta, which she left as a comment on one of our episodes. So endlessly grateful for the ongoing conversations and truth-slaying dialogue that the two of you are devoted to in this work. I look forward weekly to these beautiful, awakening, and at times gut-wrenching conversations. Thank you for your honesty and commitment to staying on the path and helping to shed light from many angles for all of us on the journey. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you all of you for being on the journey with us.